Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inquirer Live at Game Day Central alongside EJ Smith. I am Olivia Reiner. We are coming at you live from Indianapolis as we get set here for the NFL Scouting Combine. Lots to talk about as it relates to head coach Nick Sirianni and general manager Howie Roseman having their press conferences today. Plus, we've got lots of draft related topics to discuss, off-season topics to discuss. It has been too long since we last spoken with you, so we're happy to have you all here with us today. EJ, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I miss this, It's like sometimes I'll just like kind of fall into my game day central persona. I'll be at home and I'll just start talking about the Eagles for very long stretches. And my wife or my dogs, or maybe I'll be with my family. They'll be like, what are you doing?" So it's good that I get this opportunity to kind of spout off some of my Eagles takes. And yeah, no, this is a fun time of the year. I'm a big Indianapolis fan. I think it's an underrated, I guess you call it a city. Big fan of a lot of things, especially when the weather's like this. It's a lot. Really, it's quite warm here this week. So yeah, no, I'm excited to get into the show.
Some people do call this a city. Many people, in fact, would
It's a
call
little
Indianapolis a
condescending
city.
to call it not call it a city in hindsight, but
It
hey,
is a
listen,
city. It
yeah.
is. It is a great city. We have a lot of fun here every year in Indy for the combine. My first combine in quite a few years. It's been a little while, so I'm happy to be back. I'm happy that we're talking, like I said, to all of you. And as always, you know the drill. You can be a part of our conversation if you're over on the Inquirer's website watching our live stream, inquirer.com/live, I believe. You can leave us a question down there. You can also leave us a question over on Facebook or YouTube if you're watching as we're streaming on our social media platforms. We can get to some of your questions toward the end of our show today if anyone's got anything on their minds. But EJ, until then, let's get into some of our conversation, things that we want to discuss about today's press conferences. As I mentioned, we heard from Sirianni and Roseman for the first time since the end of the season. In particular, I think it was notable the fact that we haven't heard from Nick Sirianni since the Eagles hired their new defensive coordinator in Vic Fangio and offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore. The Eagles have done a really in-depth overhaul in some areas of their assistant coaches. One of the areas really, though, that they haven't done a ton of overhauling, though, is on the offensive side of the ball. They're only bringing in one new position coach in a quarterback's coach, Doug Nussmeier. So otherwise, a lot of continuity on the offensive staff going into 2024. When you look at this decision to do that, Sirianni, he describes the offense for this upcoming season as a meshing of two schemes. What could that potentially look like when you look at next season?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like after the season, I felt like Nick had a notably different tone. Almost like I don't want to say like defeated or anything like that. That might be a little bit too far, but he did have a, more of a subdued tone about, the offense and kind of like what it would look like. He mentioned the head coach of the offense. We're hiring an offensive coordinator to run the offense. And I think that today was a little bit more of a return to the Nick Sirianni we're used to seeing, who is a little bit more defiant, I would say, a little bit more confident. I think that he was a little bit more assertive about the fact that today this isn't going to be Kellen Moore coming in and changing everything. He mentioned it would be crazy to just throw away what they've done offensively in the past. So definitely sounds like more of a meshing is the word he used of two different schemes. And how that looks, it's hard to say. I was here when Doug Peterson brought in Rick Scangarello, and he brought in Rick Scangarello to kind of marry the run in the pass, is what he said, and kind of bring some of the Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay scheme into the Eagles coaching staff. And obviously, Eagles fans are probably not happy to hear me talk about Rick Scangarello because it didn't go well. Sometimes these schemes are not easily melded together. Now, I think that Nick is optimistic that Kellen Moore and him can kind of put together an offense together in a more collaborative way. We can take him at his word for that at the time being. So I am really curious. I think it's going to be one of the biggest questions going into the season is how will this offense look different? How will it look the same? I think actions speak louder than words. If you look at, as you mentioned, the staff and the fact that they retained every position coach except for their quarterbacks coach. Kellen Moore brought in two people, quarterbacks coach and a quality control coach, or an offensive assistant, as they like to call them these days. So yeah, I think that when you look at the lack of turnover on the offensive staff, I think that you can kind of glean that Nick Sirianni doesn't think the offense needs to be completely reworked. Now, maybe fans disagree, but I think, again, actions speak louder than words. And I think you can read a lot into what Nick said today, and again, how it aligns with what they've done with the coaching staff.
So the tush push will not be pushed out the window, is what you're saying, EJ.
Yeah, I think if Kellen Moore tried to take the tush push out of the playbook, he would never have made it through the door in the first place. They would have pushed him out. Yeah.
Pushed him out. Gotcha. Well, the same cannot be said for the defensive staff. We've seen really not a total overhaul of the defensive position coaches. There are still some holdovers, including Jeremiah Washburn. Rennell Williams is going to be returning as well. But otherwise, we're seeing a lot of new faces on the defensive coaching staff of Vic Fangio, a lot of people that he worked with in previous stops all across the board, with defensive line coach Clint Hurt being one of them, who, by the way, we did see out and about last night in Indianapolis. Large guy, definitely.
Yeah, I wish I saw what he had on his plate. I mean, listen, I'm not a small guy either, but that guy would even dwarf me. So I imagine that he probably went for like a porterhouse steak or something that's probably exceeding 20 ounces. You got to keep that physique going,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So when you look at the sheer number of changes to the defensive coaching staff, what do you think that means for this upcoming season and what this defense might look like under Fangio?
Yeah, I think it is like a illustrative of how the Eagles view how last season went, and I think that when you look at what they did, you can kind of read that they view that the defense was the bigger part of the problem. And listen, I think going into this offseason, they're going to need to completely rework that group. I think that their most major needs are going to be on that side of the ball, and I think as long as it doesn't really matter who's on the coaching staff if they don't fix the personnel. I think that they need 6 or 7 new starters, especially on the back end. So, I think it makes sense that they brought in a lot of people who have worked with Vic in the past. I thought it was interesting. I'm curious to hear what you thought. That Nick Sirianni conceded. Like Sean Desai didn't have that luxury. Sean Desai did not get to bring in a bunch of people that he's worked with in the past, who he is familiar with. But I think that that's kind of part and parcel with that's the price you pay to bring in somebody like Vic Fangio, who is established in this league, and again, who has a lot of connections throughout the league. So, what do I make of it? I think that the Eagles' defense is going to look completely different next year. Schematically, they might not look totally different, but personnel-wise, I think they're going to have to change a lot. And I think it started with the coaching staff. I think that's only the first of a few dominoes that we're going to see fall.
Absolutely. All right. Let's talk a little bit about now kind of some of the things that Nick Sirianni spoke about as it relates to some of the leaders in his locker room, whether it's Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown. I think a lot has been discussed about how Hurts is as a leader, his leadership style. He's not necessarily the one who's out in front and talking a lot. He tends to lead a little bit more by example. That's who he is. That's who he's been. It has been since he arrived in Philadelphia. Then plus we've also got AJ Brown. He has been active on social media, although at times perhaps we haven't always known if it is AJ Brown himself tweeting from his social media, or I should say posting on X. But that said, he did call into WIP recently to just talk about some of his thoughts on how he has been portrayed by the media, how the team has been portrayed, and he kind of pushed back on some certain things. What did Nick Sirianni just have to think about everything that has been said over the last several weeks?
Yeah, it kind of follows the same, almost defiance that, he was the sentiments that he had on the offense. I mean, he doesn't want Jalen to change, and he supports AJ. And I think it is a little bit like what do you expect the head coach to say up on the podium? But I think that's what he truly believes. I think he believes Jalen needs to be who he is. And I think that is something you hear so much in the league is you want people to be genuine. You want them to be themselves. People sniff out if you're not yourself. I think even not, that's applicable to life more than even just football. But I think that he doesn't want Jalen to be somebody he's not. But listen, I mean, our colleague Jeff McClain has reported on this, and there have been reports that have followed Jeff's reporting about the Eagles have members of this organization that want Jalen to be more accessible to teammates. They want him to open up more and be more available. And at the end of the season, Jalen alluded to it a little bit. He said this season is going to every season pull something different out of you. And he was quick to remind us that when they were successful, nobody minded Jalen Hurts' leadership style. And I think that is kind of the nature of the game. I don't think that that's an unfair part of this. It's the reality is that winning cures all. And when you're not winning, people view you completely differently. So Nick was, again, unsurprisingly supportive of Jalen. Didn't really. He mentioned like he wants to see Jalen grow as a leader, but again, he wants to see everybody grow. It's the growth mindset, one of Nick Sirianni's favorite coined phrases. So, and then on the AJ thing, he kind of defaulted to AJ as one of the best leaders on the team, and not everybody leads the same way, and not every leader isn't going to treat everybody the same way. So I think he was kind of pointing to the fact that AJ is willing to stick up for his teammates, and maybe that's why he's a little bit more active on social media and calling into the radio station on a Friday afternoon. I don't know if this is out there, but apparently they had to like FaceTime AJ to confirm that it was him because they didn't believe him. I guess like it would make sense that there'd be like AJ Brown impersonators calling WIP from time to time, but yeah, Nick was very supportive of those two. He even Nick talked about his own leadership style, and he kind of was a little wishy-washy or a little bit vague about this, but he said like that he maybe leaned into one of his core values too much and another one sort of at the expense of another core value. Again, I don't really want to speculate because it's like he wouldn't get into which ones are which, but I do think it's important to note that the two most important core values, according to Nick, are connection and accountability. So I think that there's something to be said or gleaned from there. And, he did mention today that accountability is the third of his core values. It's connect and compete. But it's really just because connect and compete are alliterations. So maybe, Nick Sirianni, a real fan of wordplay, a man after our own hearts there. So, yeah, he definitely was, like I said, supportive of his players. Conceded that there may be some areas for improvement. But again, I thought this was interesting. Like he mentioned, that they're a year removed from having one of the best cultures that any team has ever had, or any of them had ever been a part of. I think that was an overarching message from Nick today, was like that the Eagles are still a year removed from being like one of the teams that was a class of the NFL. Not really sure if that's what Eagles fans want to hear, like resting on laurels a little bit, but I think that I understand the logic of, well, to get back there, we need to look at how we were there. So, yeah, that was, again, kind of my overarching summary of his messaging today. I mean, you can read that in tomorrow's Inquirer, probably a little bit more succinctly if I had to guess.
It'll be interesting to see if that message permeates into the season or even training camp. We'll see if that continues to linger, if that continues to be a mind space that Nick Sirianni is in. Let's flip it over to Howie Roseman. And one of the things that he said today, and something that I thought was quite interesting, was talking about some of the younger players on the team, and kind of balancing, all right, like how do you know when it's time to some of these young players haven't necessarily they've had the luxury of not needing to thrust them into starting roles or roles in which they're playing a bunch. But then, how do you evaluate those players? And you look particularly on defense, there are certain players that haven't had a ton of experience actually playing. And I think inside linebacker Nakobe Dean is one of them, and all the injuries that he had last season, and then going back being kind of a backup the year prior. And now they're getting to this point where they're like, okay, well, we really need to see who this player is. And certainly there are other players that are also young that haven't had a ton of experience. I guess, how does Howie Roseman, when he looks at constructing the roster for next season, particularly on defense, but not exclusively on defense, how is he going to walk this line of, okay, we want to have, proven players, but really like players that we believe in on this team, even if they aren't necessarily getting all, or they've had all of the NFL playing time that he might like them to have had.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think I mentioned earlier, when you look at the offseason priorities for this team, so many of them come on defense. Like, if they trade Hassan Reddick, which we're going to get to at some point in the show, like they're going to need edge rusher help. Nolan Smith, again, to your point, didn't really show a lot of his rookie year. He didn't play very much. They're going to need linebacker help. They're going to need cornerback help. They're going to need safety help. And I think like the only like consolation when you have a defense that looks like the Eagles currently does is that their offense does have a young nucleus of players. They have a young core, whether it's Jalen Hurts or Landon Dickerson, Devontae Smith, AJ Brown's not even, AJ's probably a year older than Jalen, I think. I mean, these guys are all young, talented players in their prime. I mean, you look at the Eagles defense, they don't really have anybody that you would say, maybe Reed Blankenship as a young player that is in their prime. I think that that's what they're going to set out to build this offseason is, a group of young defensive players, whether it's through the draft or younger guys in free agency. I think that they're going to want to try to, kind of mesh that, whether you call it like a championship window or just kind of like the natural peak of those two groups together. I think that last year you kind of saw an offense that, maybe it topped out as an elite offense with young players and a defense that was just regressing because they had a lot of veterans and a lot of, journeymen. Again, whether it's a young player in free agency or if it's, they've got three, I think it's three picks in the top, or is it three? It's four top 100 picks, or probably like 105, 110, because that comp pick's going to be right on the edge. But they're going to have the draft capital and the free agency, the salary cap bump that we're going to talk about later, to make some moves here to rebuild this defense. And I think that is a priority. One thing I found interesting is that Nick Sirianni didn't really have as much of a glowing, like, yeah, we got to play the young guys thing. And I think that's always the push-pull of a GM and a coach, is the GM drafts the players and, wants to see what they have in the players. And the coach is focused on winning the next game. The coach is focused on, especially Nick at this point in his career, imagine they go into September, or, at this point in his coaching tenure with the Eagles, like if they go into September and he thinks that, James Bradbury gives him a better chance of winning a game than a second or Keely Ringo. Let's just even ignore the draft for a second. It's going to be hard to get Nick Sirianni to be like, all right, maybe Keely Ringo doesn't give us the best chance to win this year, but, Howie wants to see what they have long term. I mean, that's always the push-pull. Nick's coaching for his job and Howie is coaching or, trying to make decisions for his. So, again, I thought it was interesting that they didn't have the same exact answer, but it's also not surprising based off of, again, like where the priorities lie. So yeah, I definitely think that that's like the number one thing for the Eagles this offseason is going to be to get talent on all three levels of the defense. They have Jalen Carter, they've got Josh Sweat, they've got some talented pass rushers, but even, again, we'll talk about Hassan Reddick, like even that position could become a need for them at some point this offseason.
Absolutely. It's a matter of, are they going to address that need in the draft? Are they going to try to extend guys like Hassan Reddick or Josh Sweat, who are going into the final years of their contracts? What will this Eagles defense look like? And that starts with the offseason. So let's talk about what essentially, like, kind of the roadmap, I guess, the overview of the offseason. And I think you have to start with the salary cap. Salary cap exists, by the way. It is a factor. It's going to play a factor in the decisions.
I heard it's not real.
The decisions that the Eagles make this upcoming offseason. We're in the offseason, but the cap is officially going to rise $31 million in 2024 to a total of $255.4 million. That's, I don't know, it's a lot of stakes at St. Elmo, EJ, just for your reference.
Yeah, that's a good amount of stakes at St. Elmo, I'd say, and the shrimp cocktail that I famously have taken too big a bite of, and the horseradish just like lit up my whole face. But it's I would still recommend it.
You could buy a lot of it. That's what we're getting at here with all of that money. But that is the money that Howie Roseman is going to use to build his roster and bring in some talented young players and also some talented free agents, and maybe even retain some of their free agents. So the Eagles are projected to have about $27.5 million in cap space come the start of the new league year on March 13th. That does not include the space that they will need. I think it's roughly $4.5 to $5 million to sign their rookie class. But they can essentially, they can do a lot of different things to try to create more cap space, whether that is cutting Kevin Byard, that could save about $40 million. And then, of course, they're going to have to then make some decisions on the unrestricted free agent class of their own, including Jason Kelsey, Fletcher Cox, Brandon Graham. We don't know, especially if the former two are thinking about, well, we know they are mulling over their futures, all of them, but especially as it relates to Jason Kelsey and Fletcher Cox, is this going to be the end of their playing careers, or will they want to run it back here? Elsewhere, who knows? We'll see. But when you look at the cap spike, what do you think is league wide, but especially as it relates to the Eagles? What will that, especially it being a little bit greater than maybe some people around the league may have thought? What kind of impact will that have in free agency?
Yeah, I asked Howie Roseman about that, and I was a little surprised. He was very measured in his response. He didn't want to get, overly excited or jubilant about the cap jump. He sort of said, like, they still have to make the right decisions, and they can't, look at it like, he said, what did he say? If you win $5, you don't just throw that $5 away. I think that's prudent advice, but I think there are some people who you get $5 and it's like, hey, I didn't have this $5 before. I'm taking this to Five Below and getting myself I don't know what you get at Five Below these days.
I
A
don't
phone
know.
case? You still get a phone
Earbud.
case?
I used to get like earbuds and stuff.
Screen protectors were my go-to at Five Below. But yeah, so maybe maybe you blow it on a screen protector. But screen protector is a good example of what you would want to buy with your newfound salary cap space. Something responsible, something that is good for the long term. So I think that's kind of the sentiment that Howie Roseman was getting after kind of being responsible with it and not overreacting. But how does it change things for the Eagles? I think that if you look at Hassan Reddick or James Bradbury, some of these guys who maybe, well, if it's Hassan Reddick, you can extend him because you may have a little bit more room. Now, is that going to happen? I'm not really sure. I mean, I'm really curious to see how this plays out. Like, Hassan is one of the most productive edge rushers in the NFL. So, again, we're going to get to that. But to me, like that situation really does get impacted by the fact the cap jumped. Maybe with James Bradbury, again, we'll talk about him in a minute. But I think if you look at the cap jumping, maybe you didn't expect it. Maybe you are willing to take a little bit more of a dead money hit because you have that space. And they also could just take that money into free agency again to try and address some of these defensive needs. I'd be surprised at this point if they made like a really big offensive free agency move. I mean, like sneakily, like could they like look at this? It's a good guard class in free agency. Like could they target one of those guys and gives Tyler Steen another year, like another redshirt year? Maybe, but again, I think addressing the defense with that money might make sense. But again, the sentiment today, the public sentiment with Howie Roseman is like they're going to be patient. They're not going to overstep. But again, we know his track record. We know how he can be in these situations. And if an opportunity presents itself, I do think they would be aggressive because of the cap jump.
Right. So as you mentioned, EJ, this isn't just going to affect free agency. This is going to affect just the moves that they make internally on the roster, whether that's restructuring guys, extending guys, and included in that group potential candidate for especially an extension or even potentially a trade is Hassan Reddick, who is going into the final year of his contract. He is due for a raise. And this year, the way that his contract is structured, his cap hit in the final year of his deal is $21.9 million, which accounts for 8.5% of the Eagles' salary cap, which is the highest cap charge of any player on the roster. So, regardless of whether the Eagles decide to, well, if they decide to keep him, they're going to have to do something to his contract to make it kind of palatable and manageable for them this year, whether that's, like I said, extend him, restructure his deal, or there's, of course, the option potentially of trading him. And we have reported, according to our sources, that the Eagles have granted Hassan Reddick permission to seek a trade partner. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are actively shopping him. That means that they are allowing him the opportunity to see, what he could potentially command on the open market if he were to, potentially sign a new deal elsewhere. And the Eagles would facilitate that trade if it made sense for the organization in terms of the return and the cap relief. So, with all of that in mind, EJ, how do you see this situation playing out? What is the likelihood that Hassan Reddick is playing for the Eagles in 2024? And how could the cap potentially impact the whole situation, whether he stays or goes?
Yeah, no, I got into it a little bit a minute ago. I got excited. I got overzealous about it. It's a really it's one of the biggest topics of the off season. I mean, with him, like he is one of the most productive pass rushers in the NFL, like I said. But I'm not sure the league views him quite like that. Do they view him with the Myles Garrett's and the TJ Watts and even Montez Sweat is a guy who just got paid $20.5 million a year. Like Hassan is probably looking for a deal around there. But I think that the fact that he doesn't have like the prototypical edge rusher size, I think it does work against him. If you think about when he was in free agency a few years ago when the Eagles signed him, he signed what I would have considered a below market deal, and he has completely outperformed that contract. But he outperformed the contract before that too with the Panthers. So, I think that there is a little bit of skepticism in the league about. And again, I think he would agree with me here that like the league has been skeptical of him in the past. And I've heard him say like he deserves his respect. He deserves, he's done enough to prove that he is an effective pass rusher in this league. But for whatever reason, again, I think it's the size. I think it's the pedigree a little bit. Obviously he went to Temple. I also went to Temple, and us Temple Owls were always underestimated. But no, I do. I think that the league is a little bit more skeptical on him. But I'll be curious if that's changed. This is now his next opportunity to test the market. and see if there's a team out there that's willing to, expend draft capital for him and then also sign him to a new deal. So, I mean, the Eagles are definitely going to have a price here. If the team comes with them with 2 first-round picks, I could not see them turning that down. But I think that there's going to be a gray area where it's going to be, can they really replace Hassan Reddick with a player that is as good, or with a pick that could get them a player that's as good as Hassan Reddick? So if you ask me how I think it's going to play out, I honestly feel like this is going to drag out. I think that there's going to be, a lot of teams that are semi-interested, but I could see him staying here for sure. I could see him staying on the Eagles, maybe on a 1-year deal, or maybe he'll come back with a little bit of a different asking price if teams aren't willing to meet what he wants on the open market. So again, fair or unfair, I think that the league is a little skeptical on Hassan, and I'm just curious. Like, I don't know. I don't have any reason to believe that it's changed. I mean, he's been really productive, but yeah, I think that again, he's just a little bit of an unconventional edge rusher, and I think that does scare a couple teams away.
All right, well, let's flip it over to the draft and kind of where the Eagles are heading into this upcoming draft. And well, we're here at the combine, so we might as well talk about some draft needs potentially. The Eagles are slated to have 9 picks in the 2024 draft, including 3 selections in the first 2 rounds. So lots of talent up there at the top and a whole lot of needs on the defensive side of the ball. As we've already discussed on the show today, the Eagles have needs just about everywhere on the defense, especially at safety, inside linebacker, or even cornerback, as it relates to the starting roles, especially given, we'll see exactly what happens with James Bradberry in the offseason, if the Eagles, if that is a player that the Eagles would like to see return, or if they would be okay eating the dead money and moving on from James Bradberry. But regardless, because there are so many questions at this various starting roles on the defense, and the fact that the Eagles are bringing in a new defensive coordinator in Vic Fangio, which position groups might the Eagles try to target in the first couple rounds of the draft with their many picks?
Yeah, well, you mentioned it. Like, they've got so many needs on defense that it's hard to, like, they could really go a lot of different ways. I don't think they'll go linebacker. That's just not the team's philosophy, organizational philosophy, prioritization of positions. Like, they're not going to draft a linebacker in the first round. And even like, I don't disagree with that idea. Like, if I was looking through like first round linebackers in the last few drafts, it's pretty hit or miss. It's like the first round linebacker archetype is like a super athletic player who was good in college, but it's not always translatable. I feel like you can find, I was at the Super Bowl, actually. I'll plug a story from a couple weeks ago. I wrote about how the 49ers and the Chiefs had like 2 of the best linebacking cores in the NFL. All those linebackers were 2nd-round picks, 3rd-round picks, 5th-round picks. Like, you can find those guys later. But if you're asking me, like, what do I think they're going to target in the first few rounds? It's the Eagles. Like, offensive and defensive line are always in play. I don't know how long it's going to take people to realize that. I think that an heir apparent for Lane Johnson would make sense as a first-round pick. It doesn't really coincide with Howie Roseman's, sentiment that the young guys have to play. But if they get a guy like, Troy Fautanu, I think is how you pronounce it, or J.C. Latham from Alabama, both of those guys have guard versatility. Both of those guys can play at guard for a few years next to Lane Johnson. Again, we didn't see a ton of Tyler Steen, and I maybe there are viewers that are saying the Eagles need to stop with the trend of, we didn't see a lot of this young player, so they have to draft somebody else. But I think they could get a plus, like, difference making guard who can move out to tackle eventually, and I think that would make sense. But again, if they trade Hassan Reddick, I think edge rusher is a real need. So could go there. But I think the obvious one, I kind of saved the best for last year. I think cornerback makes a lot of sense. Even if they don't move on from James Bradberry, the notion that you're going to go into next season with the same cornerback duo of Darius Slay and James Bradberry, when you just saw how they performed, it's really hard to believe that they're going to do that. It's not a position that the Eagles have targeted in the first round, but I do think they view it as a premium position. I think that it's more, circumstantial that they haven't drafted a corner in the last 4 or 5 years. So, I think they've been high on some of them in the past. And I think that, again, at 22, this is a good cornerback class. NFL Network draft analyst Daniel Jeremiah said he has 14 or 15 guys with round 3 grades in this year's class. Like, there's going to be a lot of guys who are available. So we can get into names more later, but I think cornerback is probably the number one priority. And then from there, again, it's like you can't rule out if a really talented edge rusher, Dallas Turner is kind of considered that number one edge rusher prospect out of Alabama. If he's there anywhere near 22, I could see them going for a guy like that. It just is a very Eaglesy pick. So, yeah, I think it could be in the trenches for cornerback.
Offensively, EJ, you already talked about the fact that they might be looking for Lane Johnson's heir apparent in the early rounds of this year's draft. So that's out of the way. You look at the roster otherwise in terms of needs on the offensive side of the ball. Running back, they've got 3 pending unrestricted free agents in DeAndre Swift, Boston Scott, Rashad Penny. We don't know if any of those 3 players are going to be back next season. And of course, there's a question mark on the offensive line. Will Jason Kelsey be back? And if he's gone, does that mean they move Cam Jurgens to center? Would they want to keep him at right guard? So there's still some questions. There's still some decisions that will be made before free agency, ideally for the Eagles, and then in turn before the draft. Then you also look at the fact that the Eagles might also be in the market for a third receiver too. When you consider all of the needs that the Eagles have on the offensive side, aside from tackle, where do you think that they could address some of those needs in the draft this year?
Yeah, I honestly think that running back is like such a slam dunk for them to find somebody in the draft. The Eagles have a track record of drafting running backs on day 2, early day 3, and just putting them in and having them start 4 or 5 years. It's the Miles Sanders, approach. They did it with LaShawn McCoy. Obviously, they paid LaShawn McCoy also, but like I think that when you're a contending team, drafting a running back in the second or third round makes a lot of sense because you can get them on a rookie contract, get a productive running back. Jalen Wright out of Tennessee is my favorite personally. Running backs are fun to scout because you can literally just like watch their highlight tapes. Usually with players, I'm like really big on like I want to watch a full game. See all of the all of the snaps against one team, but against running backs, I literally just watch their highlights. And Jalen Wright has great highlights. I like him a lot. As far as wide receivers go, yeah, I think that they could definitely, benefit from adding a third receiver that can do the Quez Watkins thing maybe at a higher level. I think Xavier Worthy from Texas is awesome. I've watched him play a lot of games as somebody who has an interest in Texas football, I would say. I've always enjoyed watching Texas. So, yeah, I think that either of those positions, I think the offense comes more on day 2 unless, like I said, they go with an offensive lineman. But, those are just a couple of guys who I'm a little intrigued by going into the combine.
All right. Typically, we make predictions at this point in the show. There is no game happening, but we're still going to make a prediction anyway. It is way too early to be sitting here and saying, okay, this is who we think the Eagles might be targeting or a position group that they might be targeting with their first round pick at number 22 in this year's draft. I'm going to make you do it anyway. EJ, if you had to pick a position group and maybe a couple players that you're just intrigued by, that you'll be keeping an eye on at the combine, what would it be and who would they be?
So first and foremost, I would probably go with secondary. I'm going to cheat and pick 2 position groups. And I have a perfect player for this. Cooper DeJean from Iowa. He is an outside cornerback he's like good enough to play at outside cornerback in both my opinion and the people who do this for a living and, actually like watch film all year. I come late to the process and I try to form my own opinions. And I really do. I think the Cooper DeJean is a really talented secondary player, but he's a chess piece. And I think Vic Fangio kind of needs something like that. We were talking about, offensive linemen who can be versatile playing guard and tackle. Cooper DeJean could play slot cornerback. He could play safety. He could play outside corner in a way that a lot of guys can't. So yeah, if you asked me to pick one, it'd be Cooper DeJean. Could he be a safety for a couple of years before, moving to outside corner after James Bradbury, after a contract expires, maybe? I think that could make some sense. So yeah, I would go with Cooper DeJean. I like that guy a lot. I'm curious to see how he tests too.
All right, I'm going to push back on you, EJ, just because I know we've had this discussion. The Eagles have never drafted in the first round a cornerback or a safety. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the Eagles haven't had, first round grades on a member of the secondary. I think that I don't want to say that is a philosophical Eagles Howie Roseman thing. But that said, that and when I say that the Eagles haven't drafted a member of the secondary in the first round, I mean that Howie Roseman in his career, he as general manager of the Eagles, he has not drafted a member of the secondary in the first round. So that said, I'm going to push back and I'm going to go back to the trenches And I'm going to say that the Eagles are going to take an offensive tackle at number
That's
22 as
honestly where the smart money
you
is.
know,
Yeah,
I think
no,
it's
it's a
just
good
you
call.
can't
Yeah.
but I'm gonna maybe go a little bit I think I'm interested. I'm going in a different direction, EJ. I think you make a good point about the versatility. Potentially, what if what if the Eagles draft a player that can play guard and then flip him out to tackle once Lane Johnson is done. But I would also think that there are several like developmental tackles that could be available around the time that the Eagles are picking in this year's draft. I think a couple players that come to mind are Tyler Guyton out of
Yeah.
Oklahoma and even Amarius Mims out of Georgia,
Yeah,
who
that
are
guy's huge.
considered, yeah, they're definitely they are tackles,
Yeah.
but they are a little bit greener, and a good developmental picks potentially for the Eagles that can have the luxury of time essentially and learning from Lane Johnson and not necessarily having to be thrust into action right away. So I'm eager to see how they perform at the combine. And yeah, we'll see what the Eagles decide to do. And I would imagine we'll have at least more insight. We'll have the benefit of free agency beginning, and we'll be able to maybe make some more educated guesses as we get closer to the draft about what the Eagles might do in round one. So lots to discuss. We will continue to have these discussions with all of you throughout the off season. We appreciate you joining us today. It's going to do it for us in our show. Stick around with us over on inquirer.com/Eagles. We will have lots of content for you coming out of the combine and as we get further and further into the off season.
Nope.